Well, good morning if you are somewhere along the Pacific Ocean. Good afternoon if you are in Brooklyn or Manhattan or Cambridge, Massachusetts or Washington, D.C. Good evening if you're in Cambridge, England or somewhere in Norway. Greetings to people all around the world who are following Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Adagio, the place where classical music happens. As you know, Adagio is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to fans around the world. My guest today is a gentleman, I call him a friend, who I've known for quite a long time, something like 24 years at least, 23, 24 years. Um, he and I, in different careers, have gone through different iterations, but we've always followed each other's work. And I'm a great admirer of his work and the way he's moved through a career and a life in music, doing many important things and not always all visible at the same time to everybody watching. And part of what I'd like to speak with about, his name is Theodore Wiprud, but I call him Ted, and um, is how you juggle many things at once and have a successful, busy career in music, but where there are many constraints and requirements and demands on your time and for your attention. But Ted, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
So I know that you are of Norwegian origin. You may not know this, but I have a great passion for Norway, and I've spent a lot of time there. Would you do us the honor of pronouncing your name in the original Norwegian?
Sure. Since Ellis Island, it's spelled in the United States Wiprud, but in Norway it's spelled Viperud. So it's Viperud. That's my closest approximation of a Norwegian accent, Viperud. Vipa is a beloved wild bird, perhaps like a meadowlark, and a rude common last name ending is a farm. So
Mhm.
people are identified by the real estate that they lived on.
And do you know where in Norway your ancestors lived?
Yes, I've been there to visit my cousins who are still on the same piece of land. It's about an hour southwest of Oslo, near a town called Notodden.
And what's it like?
It's gently rolling farmland. When I saw the ancestral piece of land, I could see it was in a rather narrow valley. It was a constricted piece of farmland, and my great great grandfather had five sons, and it was going to be a problem, with a small farm to develop. So four of them came to the United States, and one stayed behind. Hence, I have cousins there, and many cousins here in the United States.
And was there a musical tradition in the family going back centuries?
No, not really. Although my grandfather, who was born in Norway and then lived in the upper Midwest of the United States, did have musical and theatrical talent. He went around starting small orchestras in every little town or homestead that he lived in. But his work was in the medical field. He wasn't a doctor, but he ran service organizations for doctors. Um, so there's perhaps some musical background, but no professional musicians that I'm aware of.
Now, American listeners know that when we say Norwegians in the upper Midwest, we usually mean Minnesota. Were they from Minnesota or where?
Yeah, they moved to Minnesota initially, but then there are cousins, distant relations who have moved all the way out to Washington State. So it's sort of in that Montana, Washington, Idaho belt,
I mention this
Dakotas.
because in when airlines in the pre alliance era picked destinations that they thought would be profitable, there was a nonstop flight from Minneapolis, St. Paul to Stockholm, and
Oh,
it connected then to Oslo. And there was another connection to Denmark, although the main places were Norway and Sweden for visiting. Because when you go to Minnesota, and I lived there for 9 very cold months, um, you find a bit of Scandinavia in the upper Midwest of the United States in terms of the culture, in terms of the accents, in terms of the what's eaten for the foods. People who know someone named Garrison Keillor, who is a wonderful writer who was sort of the Norwegian American bard of the upper Midwest, talking about the peculiarities of it. There's a comedic television show from the 1980s called The Golden Girls, and one of the characters, Rose Nyland, is from a fictional town called St. Olaf, Minnesota. And it's said tongue in cheek, but it's those Minnesotans, people with their round O, are known as Minnesota Nice. And they went, I always wondered, why did they go from cold, cold Norway to cold, cold Minnesota when they could have gone to Florida or anywhere else? But they picked farmland that in some way related to what they knew back home in Scandinavia and built dairy farms and formed farmers' collectives. And the state of Minnesota had a labor party for a long time that was sort of a collective, almost socialist style form of farming, and education and public support was done more in the Scandinavian style than really anywhere else in the United States, apart from certain left-wing areas of Brooklyn and California and Madison, Wisconsin, and to some degree, Austin, Texas. So, but I know that you were born in Washington, D.C. How is it that
That's
you were there and not Minnesota?
right. Yeah, my grandfather, whom I mentioned, had by that time moved to Washington, D.C. to run the District of Columbia Medical Association.
Mm-hmm.
And so then that just led to my parents settling in D.C. Yeah, I guess more to the point, my father finishing law school started working at the Department of Justice, and so settled in D.C. Yeah. So I've
But
been
this
sort
was
of a Northeast Corridor kid, from
mhm.
Washington and then school in Boston and then settling in New York.
And that in some way perhaps answers my next question, but I'd like you to answer it more. I know that you studied biochemistry at Harvard and you're a composer and a musician. Why?
Yeah.
Nothing wrong with biochemistry. I studied it too, actually, but I'm interested because I didn't know this about you until I did some research. That why did you study biochemistry?
Well, I guess I was a math and science kid, as I came through high school. That's what I was really excited about. At the same time, I was taking piano lessons and, becoming sort of just musically literate, I would say. But it was when I went to Harvard, that I began taking music theory classes and began to discover that there's a science behind the way music sounds. That there are systems and that you can actually reverse engineer it to make music that evokes emotions. When I realized that I could kind of engineer music of my own, somehow it seemed seamless to me from math and science through music theory into composing. But, so I was composing by the time I finished college, but I thought it more prudent. You could only take one degree at the time at Harvard. There were no minors. And so I thought it prudent to stay with biochemistry because who knows, right? But then surprisingly enough, Boston University accepted me into a master's program in composition, and I haven't done much biochemistry ever since.
I think I'm prodding a bit on the bio part of biochemistry because chemistry is what it is. It's something I went to a science high school, by the way, but that was probably not my best choice because I have interest in science. I'm really a failure at math, so that therefore that was a real struggle for me. The science has interested me because I'm very attracted to the scientific mind and how it works and how the scientific mind connects with music and different kinds of abstractions and thinking abstractly, but with the purpose of trying to discover or understand either something new or something very old that we haven't understood yet. Um, as I said, I went to a science high school here in New York, and I was very drawn to the teacher, professor, Mrs. Shapiro, who was teaching biochemistry. And that was my main science at the Bronx High School of Science. And because she was so inspiring about how what we eat, when we eat it, and so forth affects our bodies, our health, how we process and
Hmm.
digest things, what nutrients are, what vitamins and minerals are. And I was interested enough in that in high school that I began to do cooking to understand the processes of how
Ah.
chemicals are broken down, ingested, excreted, and so forth, good chemicals. Um, and so that although I went into a career in opera, I always did cooking and biochemistry and wrote 8 cookbooks so that people asked me, but they've
Wow.
never asked me about the biochemistry part. I was really fascinated about the relationship between food products and the body and health. So physics and chemistry,
So that's how
biology was interesting, but go ahead.
I was going to say that's how the dots connected for you through cuisine.
Yeah, because actually I was admitted, we have now it's called LaGuardia, but at that time it was the High School of Music and Art. I was admitted for singing, but my parents who worked in the arts were panicking that God forbid our son should go into a career in the arts, which is so unpredictable and you never know where your next money is coming from. And if you get into a science high school, then go do that and you can continue your music lessons. Frankly, I found Bronx science so difficult, a lot of it, that I discontinued my music lessons until I got to college when I returned to them again. But so therefore, I was very focused. Unfortunately, Bronx science, I'm saying this 50 years after the fact, did not allow us to diversify. So I wanted to learn a second language. As suppose we all had to take one language, I wanted to take two. Um, I finished all the math that I had to do, but never touched it again because it was torture. But I had to take 5 sciences every term, and one history
Wow.
and one English and um, one language, which was Spanish in my case. And so, what struck me about that education, although I had wonderful teachers, is that it was imbalanced. And I always felt that history and language was being compromised, even though I had my best teacher in high school was my history teacher, and she inspired me in a lot of ways to become a history major in college, even though I intended to work in opera, because she said, you have to know the stories, the languages, the political movements. You have to know everything about your
Mm.
characters in opera. And she was open to the fact that I was not going to become a scientist or a mathematician. But she encouraged me to become a history major, which I did. Where I went to college, we could have a major and a minor. So that my major was Italian Renaissance history because opera was born in the Italian Renaissance, late Renaissance, and a minor in theater and opera production so I could learn the practicalities of producing opera, which I did, and moved to Italy when I was 19. I left Wisconsin because Wisconsin was lovely but cold like Minnesota at the time. And I moved to Italy and I immersed completely in the culture that produced
Wow.
opera. So, um, but how do you feel through your lifetime that your scientific underpinnings have informed your work as a musician and composer?
That's a really good question. I think it's just kind of a clarity of thought and of method, perhaps. I'm kind of speculating here because it's not something that is sort of at a conscious level. But I think, understanding the scientific method and what it takes to set up an experiment and understand the results of it, um, not only helps me understand what's going on in the world regarding climate science and so forth,
Mhm.
but also it's just kind of an approach to thinking that is useful in administration and also in creativity. There's so much creativity in science as well. It's not really a different set of muscles.
I recently, I'm not boasting and I'm not name dropping here, but it happens to be true. In December of 2024, had a long conversation with Renee Fleming, the soprano, who has taken a great interest in what is called music and mind. And she edited a beautiful book that came out, including many essays by many people. You have it there. Okay. It's a wonderful book. I'm
Yes.
and I'm glad you showed it to us. And it's very inspiring because it's about music and health. It's about music and healing pain. And I don't necessarily mean emotional pain, but sometimes physical pain and how that works.
Yeah.
How
Yeah.
what used to be called biofeedback, but I don't think we use that term anymore, allows music to penetrate the brain in places that medication, quote, real medication, drugs, cannot reach or does not reach or have side effects. Um, we know that there are areas of the brain where music resides, even if people develop dementia and they lose memories of daily life, but somehow the music resides there more. Um, so I was asking Renee Fleming about this, and she said that when she was, this is public and she writes about it in the book, was dealing with stage fright in the late 1990s, how she sought scientific solutions rather than medical solutions. And it led to her interest in music and mind, not music and the mind, but music and mind. And she later got to know Francis Collins, who was the head of the National Institutes for Health until very recently. And he loved music. And so they started having dialogues between one another from a musician's point of view and from a scientist's point of view. And then Renee Fleming knows Deborah Rutter, who's the head of the Kennedy Center in Washington. And Renee Fleming went to Deborah Rutter and proposed what Renee called a platform for science at the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts in Washington. And from that has grown this whole movement. One of them is called Sound Health, about how sounds of different forms can promote or either promote health or ease pain. Um, she and they have also worked with hospitals such as Mount Sinai here in New York on cognitive health, cognitive restoration, let's call it. Um, I have been involved for many years with the home that Giuseppe Verdi built in Milan, a rest home for retired musicians. Do you know about this home?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, it's called the Casa di Riposo per Musicisti.
Huh.
And
That I
Verdi,
didn't know.
yeah, so it's a rest home for musicians. It's not
Yeah.
quote an old age home. It's anything but. Because Verdi, who is a very benevolent man, believed that he had his success because of all the musicians who played his music, but that at that time, in the end of the 19th century in Italy, there were no provisions for pensions of any kind for musicians. So he
Mhm.
built this home. It was funded with the royalties from all but three of his operas. And it opened, he died January 27th, 1901. It opened October 10th, his birthday, 1902, and is still in business and is a place where these musicians gather not only to eat and have a place to rest, but to make music. And when I've gone there, you see these 85-year-olds and 95-year-olds playing piano, violin, singing Tosca, and so on. And with advances in medicine that keeps people alive longer, they've now built a wing apart from the main area where people with cognitive diseases, dementia, Alzheimer's, and so on, reside, and they have special care for them there. All of this funded by what is now the endowment, plus contributions from musicians like Pavarotti and Renata Tebaldi, who made a lot of money. I pitch in, and it's a wonderful institution. And there's one woman there, I've discussed this before, who was in the chorus of the opera in Verona, and she has Alzheimer's. And I would go visit and talk to the Alzheimer's patients in Italian. And she said to me one day, "Would you like me to sing something for you?" And I said, "Absolutely." And she was a chorus member, not a soloist, but she sang Visi d'arte from Tosca. And she sang it very well. She knew all the words. But then after she finished, I said, "Thank you." And she said, "For what?" Because she had forgotten that she had just sung it. But it was a perfect example of how embedded music and the words that goes with the music can be, that she remembered every note and every word of the Sadia from Tosca, but then forgot that she sang it. So
Yeah.
I have long been fascinated by the music and science connection. It's a big world that people can find their places in. I've, on this program, had professors from Peabody in Baltimore, plus Johns Hopkins University Medical School, and I've had them on together talking about that. I had a fellow on, I'm blocking his name right now, who lives in Maryland, who takes his guitar and he goes to veterans hospitals and plays for veterans with cancer, with other pain issues, as a way of relieving their pain. And because apparently they become so focused on the music that they don't feel their pain. And that's a very, very interesting phenomenon. So a bit of a digression, but it's because I didn't know about your science background until I started researching for this conversation. Now,
Yeah.
um, you and I met in 2001 when you were education director at the Brooklyn Philharmonic, which was resided at BAM, Brooklyn Academy of Music, where I, as a very little boy, heard my first symphonic pieces. Not my first opera, but I heard my second, third, fourth, and fifth operas. I heard my first opera at the Met. Um, and it's a wonderful, wonderful institution that is still thriving today and very much worth people knowing about. Parenthetically, I'll say New York City did not become New York City until 1898. And therefore, Brooklyn was a more populous city than was New York City, which was Manhattan. And until the Brooklyn Bridge was built in the late 1880s, there was not a connection except by boat between Brooklyn and Manhattan. And so, therefore, the Brooklyn Academy of Music was a wonderful institution that predated the Metropolitan Opera. It did not predate the New York Philharmonic, but it predated Carnegie Hall. And when artists from the Met would go on tour to Brooklyn, such as Enrico Caruso, they would travel to Brooklyn and make their appearance and then travel back to Manhattan. And the way you and I live now, you live in Brooklyn, I live in Manhattan. We can reach each other easily if we want to. I ran into you not too long ago at Carnegie Hall, and that meant that you had to travel from Brooklyn to Manhattan. And but it's a very different world, and Brooklyn has its own very powerful culture that is distinct, I would say, from Manhattan. You were not born in Brooklyn, but as you said, you're a son of the Northeast Corridor, which is to say Washington, Baltimore, Philadelphia, uh, Delaware, I suppose, Wilmington, Delaware, um, parts of New Jersey, New York City, New Haven, Connecticut. I'm doing the Amtrak route, Providence, Rhode Island, 3 stops in Boston, and then finally Boston South Station. So, talk about how Brooklyn is distinct culturally and historically, and why you live in and I assume love Brooklyn.
Yeah, Brooklyn has turned out to be just a wonderful home for us. We've lived on the same block here in Windsor Terrace, Brooklyn, for almost 35 years. 35 years on, yeah, 35 years in 2025. Um, when I was working at the Brooklyn Philharmonic, Robert Spano was the
Mm-hmm.
music director. And it was just a really exciting time for me because Brooklyn Phil was very vital, was doing uh, really interesting thematic programming, exploring themes through, which was a fairly new concept at that time. Um, And so the idea of helping connect that kind of programming with neighborhoods in Brooklyn and through cultural institutions like the Brooklyn Museum of Art, another long-standing institution, through the Brooklyn Public Libraries, that was very exciting. It turned out I only worked there 3 years before I got an offer from the New York Philharmonic to come across to Manhattan and begin to explore that culture as director of education at the New York Philharmonic. But here in Brooklyn, we live halfway between Prospect Park and Greenwood Cemetery. Okay, so it's very beautiful area. I go regularly to visit one of my idols, Leonard Bernstein, over in Greenwood Cemetery, and my major teacher, David Del Tredici, who sadly died within the last year and is buried near Leonard Bernstein. Um, and we're in the park all the time. One of BAM's great institutions is Dance Africa, which is, an annual fall festival. There's just so much diversity of cultures here in Brooklyn. It just feels really, really vibrant. The Labor Day parade, which is West Indian, is a really lively presentation. The first place I ate curried goat was along that parade route. It's a terrific thing to pick up. So yeah, so we've really loved Brooklyn, and the fact that you can actually park in front of your house.
Mm.
Do you do that in
Um,
Manhattan?
I don't drive. I'm a Manhattanite. I don't know how to drive. Um, and by the way, I noticed you say Manhattan. If people are born in Brooklyn, they grow up in Brooklyn or Queens, they don't refer to it as Manhattan. They call it the city because in
Exactly right. You're going to the city,
you're going to the
right?
city. In the past, when these were different entities, they were not Manhattan. I mean, that they were Manhattan, but they were not New York City. So even now, the preferred usage in many parts of Brooklyn, Queens, is where do you live? You live in New York City? No, I live in Queens. I live in Brooklyn.
Right.
You live in New York
Right.
City? No, I live in Brooklyn. And these are New York City, if I recall, has 32 bridges, and we have lots of rivers and waterways and so on. And therefore, there are natural barriers between these places. But between bridges and tunnels, it's quite easy to get from one to the other. And if you're sitting on the subway or going over a bridge, you don't notice anymore that necessarily you're going from one borough to the next, except that in the case of going to your part of Brooklyn, which I knew as a very little boy, it's very leafy. It's there, as you said, there are parks. Greenwood Cemetery, by the way, Green hyphen Wood Cemetery, um, is I don't know if it's the largest in New York City, but it's one of the largest, and it's a wonderful place for your final rest. And many illustrious New Yorkers and non reside either there or in the Bronx or parts of Queens. Manhattan has very few cemeteries because there's not much space, but they recently found an African American cemetery from almost 200 years ago in Lower Manhattan. But Lorenzo da Ponte, who moved here from Vienna after Mozart died with his wife and founded the Italian department of what became Columbia University, is buried in Queens, for example.
Hmm.
People don't know that. Most people don't know that. And but the thing about Brooklyn that I love, among many things, is that it's really designed like a European city, in that it has the Grand Army Plaza. It has big boulevards such as Atlantic Avenue and Flatbush Avenue and Ocean Parkway and Empire Boulevard. Then it has districts and neighborhoods and parks and many churches. Part of the landscape of Brooklyn that people don't realize until they go there is how many churches there are all over the borough. When I was a very little boy, my first foreign cuisine was actually Norwegian food because it was a part of Brooklyn where Norwegian seamen, when the ships arrived, and there was a Norwegian church, and they had a smorgasbord every Sunday, I believe, where for $2 or $3, the Norwegian sailors could have Norwegian food. And my parents learned about that and took me there. so that every Sunday we would eat Norwegian food in Brooklyn. It was delicious. And what I
Hmm.
learned from that, apart from that there are other kinds of foods, was that you don't have to fill up your plate. This was not about all you can eat. It was about pairing and savoring and how certain acidic
Hmm.
things would go with, say, boiled potatoes, but other things would go with other things, how mustard became a condiment. I had so much education at that smorgasbord, and then
Hmm.
I'd sit down with the Norwegian sailors and talk about Norway, and that led to my very early fascination with Norway. But Brooklyn still has all of that, all these churches. Not too well, a little far from where you live. There's something called Bergen Street. And my grandfather, for a while, lived on what he called Beugen Street, not Bergen Street. And that was sort of Norwegian Brooklyn right there. And then Brooklyn
Hmm.
also has a Navy Yard where my father was in the Navy. It has a big port, and it has a vast expanse of beaches on the Atlantic Ocean, which is something that the other boroughs don't have. And the D train and the Q train and other trains lead from other parts of the city to the beach. And in the summer, when I was a kid, 1 million people would be on that beach in hot weather in the summer. And people would arrive from everywhere, not so much with their cars as on the subway. And it is a remarkable thing for people who don't know New York City. They think of it as Manhattan and skylines and theaters and so on. We are on the Atlantic Ocean. We have fishing trawlers that go out and bring in fish, and parts of Brooklyn, but also the Bronx and Queens and Manhattan, have a fish-based diet based on the fish and seafood of the North Atlantic. And Manhattan itself used to be the most fertile ground in the world for oysters. So more
Right.
than any place else, they kept the water clean until industrial pollution came, destroyed the oysters. Now they're bringing back oysters not to eat, but to clean the water. So, but for people who don't know, when people come to New York City and they stay in Times Square and they go to a Broadway show and Rockefeller Center and I hope Lincoln Center and Carnegie Hall, I say to them, go out to the boroughs and discover the variety that we have, but nowhere. Queens has more ethnic groups of different types, but they're not as entrenched in the way that they are in Brooklyn, where these roots go back. Brooklyn is 400 years old as a place where people live, which for the United States is very old. Um, in your neighborhood, is it very mixed? Is there more of one kind of group or another?
When we first moved in 35 years ago in this neighborhood, it was pretty much Irish and Italian, and sort of civil servant, working class type of neighborhood. Since then, it's changed a fair amount. There's a lot more diversity and a lot more income. You know, a lot more people who commute to Manhattan, to the city, people
The
who have
city.
to go to the city for work, right? Right. It didn't necessarily used to be that way. We're only the third owners of our house in 120 years. So
And this is a very Brooklyn
stable neighborhood.
question. Are there churches nearby and do they have musical activity?
Yes, yes, many churches. You're right about that. City of churches and a lot of
Yeah.
musical activity.
Talk about the musical activity specifically in Windsor Terrace and nearby where you live, as opposed to the famous theaters we'll get to, like BAM and Carnegie Hall and Lincoln Center.
Well, that's a pretty far cry. Windsor Terrace, one of the wonderful things about Windsor Terrace where we live is that it's a very quiet neighborhood. Um, you know, young adults try to get to more exciting neighborhoods from here, you know. But every church has its choir and its public concerts. Um, and there are some, increasingly, there are clubs and things. Burbess is a well-known venue, small venue for sort of uh, all kinds of ethnic and jazz music that's walking distance from here. So there's all kinds of things, but it's kind of purposely not like the city.
But that's more than okay. I love the
Yes.
fact that in various parts of New York City, that there are thriving musical cultures and activities that don't necessarily make it in mentions in the New York Times, but that does not remove their validity and importance. Um, I think it's south and maybe east of where you live is a very large Russian community and Ukrainian community, and they blend more there, thankfully, than they do back in Europe. Um, and there's a very powerful musical culture there because many of them are emigres who played or sang in what was the Soviet Union. And there are
Hmm.
Russian orchestras, and there are, when I've spoken at BAM, and I'm sure you had a similar experience when you were at BAM, um, a large proportion of my audience comes from those neighborhoods that are Russian and Ukrainian. And there's a great passion for music. The Italians who still live in Brooklyn have that. The Jews certainly do. Um, the people of African descent all over the borough have wonderful musical traditions. Um, when I was a little boy, there was a little boy named Noel Pointer who was black, and he was, even at the age of 5 and 6, a fabulous violinist. And I remember that we all in our school, in our kindergarten, would watch Noel Pointer play and just be astonished. And so, therefore, I always, as I just said, you tell people don't become Manhattan centric in your understanding of New York City for music and culture of all types. And if you're looking for music to
Yeah.
hear or play, that it's all over New York City. There was a no longer with us, but a company called Loft Opera that was very trendy about 15 years ago. And they were founded in a loft, which was a former industrial space on the Gowanus Canal, which is in another part of Brooklyn where you are, and is still an industrial waste site that was so polluted in the worst part of the pollution era that it'll take centuries to clean up. And therefore, real estate there is very cheap because it's toxic. But I remember that they founded this opera and rented a loft for very little money and did Don Giovanni there for their premiere. And it was one of the best productions of Don Giovanni I've ever seen. And these were basically college students from around New York City who dressed they wore their own clothing, but the man who played the Don was dressed differently from Leporello. Anna was dressed differently from Zerlina. And the total prop table was one fake dagger and a very large jar of strawberry jam. And the reason for that was every time someone got killed, they would dip their finger into the jam and then do a line of red on the neck or on the hand. And that's how they indicated someone was being killed. And it was brilliant.
Yeah.
And Loft Opera persisted for a while. They performed all over Brooklyn primarily. And they did Tosca Salome, La Boheme. Those of you who remember there was Superstorm Sandy in 2011, in which much of Brooklyn was had a blackout and was flooded and so on. And Loft Opera had found a space that had been flooded and had mold and mildew on the walls. And they did La Boheme in that cold space so that we in the audience experienced the cold and the mildew and really understood what Rodolfo and Mimi were dealing with because we were all coughing. It was not just Mimi. So Brooklyn is edgy and vibrant, and I'm not here to do a commercial
Right.
for Brooklyn, but I'm talking about it because that's where you live and that's where you've chosen to live.
Right. Right.
And I love talking to people who are creative types who live in Brooklyn because it's very particular.
Yeah. Yeah. But don't try to buy a place in Gowanus now. It's expensive now. There are big buildings going up.
I know toxicity and air pollution and water pollution is included in the package, but that is
That's right.
the one part of New York City I just would not live in. So you notably, very importantly, left the Brooklyn Philharmonic and moved to the New York Philharmonic in 2004. And if I recall, you were there for until 2018. And
That's right.
that was a notable era for the New York Philharmonic. I was very honored to be asked by you numerous times to be one of the educators. And, but I can say that as a music lover, but also someone who didn't work at the Philharmonic, that I watched a bit from nearby, but from the outside, how you approached music education and how there was, in my view, not just one way of doing it, but numerous ways. And I felt that you did it so incredibly well because you did not stick to one tried and true way.
Mhm.
When you were invited by the Philharmonic to come to the city and be their education vice president for education, how did that work? Did they recruit you and did you have ideas, or how did you evolve the ideas that really, frankly, was so incredibly successful at music education of the New York Philharmonic?
Yeah, they recruited me and I came with ideas. I have to say, one of the luxuries of going to that institution at that time was the opportunity to build on the work of my immediate predecessors there. Tom Cabanis was just before me, and before him, Polly Kahn. Um, and between them, they had built so many wonderful programs that I came to the Philharmonic with the same philosophical mindset, which we can talk about, that had spawned their programs. So I was able then to fit right in and take them further. Um, but it was really already a very ambitious and sprawling set of programs to come in and work with. I'd say, they all sort of come are built on a foundation of what we call student-centered learning, right? That learning has to be motivated from within the learner. The learner is not an empty vessel into which we pour information, right? We if anything, we just need to light a spark, connect with something the learner already knows. The learner is already expert in their own experience. And when it comes to music, there is no one way to experience any piece of music. I'm not going to tell you what Shostakovich means. It'll have its own meaning for you. Um, so I'd say that there were three like distinct approaches to education going on, and each of them valid in its own way. One was the young people's concerts, right? The most famous and visible part of education at the New York Philharmonic, which it was such a joy and privilege to step into running those, planning those, programming them, and hosting them for many years. Um,
Talk about their
that's
history because you were the
yeah.
host of them, but I think if I'm correct, the founder was Leonard Bernstein. Or did
No,
they
as a matter of fact,
date Lenny and he
yeah.
picked it up and ran with it? Okay.
Yeah, yeah. Many people think that Bernstein created them. They were founded by Uncle Ernie Schelling. Ernest Schelling founded them in 1924, if I remember correctly, certainly in the 20s. But Leonard Bernstein, of course, put them on television with CBS. At that time, they were doing about 7 or 8 young people's concerts each year, each season, and he would do 4 of them. So he was never like the exclusive host, but the 4 that were on television, he was the host and creator. And they're all available now on DVDs. DVDs, remember them? You have to put them in an optical reader. They're probably available to stream as well, but um, yeah, they're incredible to watch. They're such a masterclass in education and in enthusiasm, right? In charisma that makes you just eager to understand what this guy is telling you. So they have that great history, and after he left, I think there was a long period of sort of searching for what they could be without Leonard Bernstein, right? And, and I think we found an answer to that question, uh, whether or not it's probably not the answer, but an answer was to create these shows continuing to have the kind of real musical exploration that we love about Bernstein, asking real musical questions and illustrating them with a range of music. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Continue with those kinds of themes, working with a playwright, Tom Dulac, became our writer and was really wonderful at dramatizing the learning, staging it in such a way that it was fun to follow along. Um, and then having a number of guest artists who might be actors. We would often have soloists who were there with the Philharmonic for that week. Um, yeah, it was really wonderful to have all those resources to put together really an idealized and to me, to my way of thinking, a fairly ideal way of presenting music to young people with the aim of of their enjoyment of learning more about music. They're wanting to experience music more. Not so much that they should know more about music, but that they should fall in love with the orchestra and with music.
Hmm.
Yeah. So that was
Um,
one whole thing, that kind of presentational.
right. As you know, I've written two books on music, Opera 101 and Classical Music 101. For international listeners, 101 means your first university course, your first contact in a meaningful way. But the subtitles were A Complete Guide to Learning and Loving Opera, A Complete Guide to Learning and Loving Classical Music. And I had some pushback from my editors because they wanted words like appreciation. And I said, no, it's not appreciation. That's too passive. Learning and loving. And we kept the title,
Loving.
but I really meant that because how can one be passive about music? You may not love every piece, but it's a guide to learning and loving the music. It's a lot more active and engaging in its way. I learned to love music because I had a father who was a musician. He used to practice at my cradle, my crib, literally for hours, and it sort of built in my knowledge of the musical scale. He played the trombone. He was a beautiful player. My mother, when I was 6 and 7, um, went to work in what was called Lincoln Center, but there was only one building. The building was then called Philharmonic Hall. Then it became Avery Fisher Hall and now David Geffen Hall. But it opened in 1962. And at that time, if you remember your New York geography, diagonally from Philharmonic Hall on 66th Street was a little movie theater called the Cinema Studio. And next to it was John's Coffee Shop. It was on the place where the Barnes and Noble was, and now a department store. And above John's Coffee Shop and the Cinema Studio were 3 floors, and all of Lincoln Center Incorporated was in those 3 floors.
Really?
And everybody, so that if the vice president had to talk to someone in marketing or publicity or fundraising, it was always a he then, and now thankfully women too. He would walk from one floor to the next. And when they needed food, they went to John's Coffee Shop. And John's Coffee Shop is no longer there, but it moved to Amsterdam Avenue and 67th Street, and it's now called Old John's Coffee Shop. And it still has a similar menu to what it had 60 years ago. 7 people who worked at Lincoln Center at that time had little children, and I was one of the 7. And there was no place for childcare. There were no provisions for childcare. So we 7 were put in the lobby of Philharmonic Hall to be looked after by a security guard. And one day Leonard Bernstein came sweeping in for a rehearsal, and he turned and he said in his deep cigarette-soaked voice, "Who are these children?" And the guard became frightened, and he said, "These children have to come into the theater right now." And we were brought in, and he took the podium with the New York Philharmonic, and we were seated over his left shoulder, somewhat part of the left, so that he could see us. We were near the string section. And as he began to work on a program, whether it was that week's performances or whether it was the Young People's program, he would turn and ask us questions, not as a test, but do you know what I mean when I say piano? Do you know what I mean when I say there's a rest there? And we 7 got our music education from Maestro Bernstein, Letty, he later became to me, and the New York Philharmonic. And we were the template on which he built his Young People's concerts by gathering what we knew and didn't know. So that if we all 7 of us didn't know something, he would teach it. in the concert.
Hmm.
And so for that reason, when you learn and, among the first pieces he played were Brahms and Dvorak and pieces of the classic repertory. But then he would introduce Aaron Copland, which sounded different from the others. He would play this guy named Mahler that was very long and tiring for us, but it was it was painless, is what I'm saying. So that when I try to teach, I try to, let's say, make it painless in that having been a history major, I know that you could be told to memorize everything. Like, when was the Battle of Hastings? Or when did Michelangelo do the Pietà? Things like that. That doesn't really matter. What matters is what does it mean and how do you feel? And what Bernstein and my father and other people, but specifically those two, imparted in me and in others was it's what we feel, it's not what we know. And that, to me, when I teach, is at the foundation of I try to use the music not to have people feel what I feel, but to develop within themselves their own responses and their own feeling, and that there's very little right and wrong. I could say, this is in C, or that doesn't really matter unless you're becoming a composer, an instrumentalist, or musicologist. But how does this make you feel? And it is, I think, foundational in teaching. And what I loved when you were at the Philharmonic is that I never discussed this with you, and I don't think if you articulated to your staff, I never knew that. Um, but I always felt that the lessons that I gave, but moreover the classes that I attended that you organized that other people gave, were so inspiring to me because it was always about how we felt. And so that there really was a direct personal connection to the music. And
Yes.
I'm going to take a little bit of a detour and then I'll bring us back. The last time I ran into you in person was at Carnegie Hall in December of 2024. The Czech Philharmonic was in town and they were doing a wonderful series of Czech music. And, people who might be of a certain political persuasion might not be happy with the developments in this country, and there are wars in the world and so on. And, personal challenges that we all have. And I was
Mhm.
kind of beaten down by all that. And then spending 3 nights with the Czech Philharmonic, where I realized that Czech music, maybe more than certain other countries, is really about melody. And I so fastened on not quote understanding the melodies, but just letting the melodies wash over me, these gorgeous melodies, that I really felt that after 3 days of that, I felt better. I was able to, go out in the world and face the realities of life that all of us face, not just me, all of us face. Um, and that was such a striking example because I didn't analyze it. I simply experienced it. And when I saw you there one night, we sort of looked at each other wordlessly, and then I started babbling in Italian because clearly you were moved. And I didn't think to ask you, so how's it going for you? I just could see on your face that there was something very particular about those performances. So that's my digression. But the point is, melody has a lot to be proud of. And I think that if I can get people to love music through melody, beat and rhythm are important, absolutely. And sometimes the beat is the heartbeat, it's, the pulse, whatever. But if you have a gorgeous melody, whether it's Dvorak or Richard Rodgers or whomever, um, it's very powerful. What do you think?
Yeah, melody, of course, goes back to the voice, right? Like our first instrument as a species is the voice, right? And so we identify melody with the voice. But and this brings to mind the idea of points of entry. You know that any piece of music, there are different ways you can enter it. It could be through the melody, it could be through the rhythm, it could be through some association it has for you that the composer had no idea, but that's your association. And that's one of the um, part of the art of music education in the student-centered learning world is helping people find their point of entry. What does this make you think of? And then let's explore that. How does it make you feel? But then let's explore that. And how is the music making you feel that way? Are there other pieces of music that make you feel that way, and why? Yeah. So melody, and certainly those concerts of the Czech Philharmonic. I just heard that one where I saw you there, but it was just glorious. And in a way, it was like without any particular purpose or reason. It was just beautiful music. Daniel Trifonov played that night, the Dvorak piano concerto, and yeah, it was just amazing. Yeah.
Um, one approach that I take when I teach very little kids music is I'll play music, usually recordings, and because kids are very expressive and not always intimidated, I always like to see
Yeah.
who gets up and dances.
Right.
Because I
Right.
remember so well what I got up to dance to was the Haydn trumpet concerto. And my dad said to me, "So you like that?" I said, "Yeah," because it made me dance. And then, he'd play other music. In his case, he'd often play it live for me. And I didn't feel the impulse to dance to most things, but it's always so interesting to me because, again, no right and wrong. But if you see that a child is particularly drawn to one piece or one type of music, you continue to offer things that relate to that music to him or her because that's the way in. I like how you describe that as the
Mhm.
way in. You
Yeah.
also, at the New York Philharmonic, did a great deal, planned, organized, led, of what's called adult education. What is the challenge of educating, I'm using that word, adults about music in ways that are different from kids?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, whether you can apply um, the same kind of thinking, the same frames of thought as you do with kids. I think with the adult education, uh, is more a question of giving them more tools for for loving the music. I mean, when adults come for education, they're making the choice to be there, right? The big difference with kids is somebody else is choosing for them that they're going to be there, right? And then you start from there. But the kids may not have a relationship yet with the music that they're about to hear, and so you try to create the context for that. With the adults, they've already chosen to be there, and so they're already sort of thirsty for more knowledge. I think that they were more interested in actual information that that is not important to the kids who are just learning this music for the first time. Um, but we had a number of faculty like yourself who would give all kinds of talks, some sort of large venue talks, some small venue talks, and really, we let 1,000 flowers bloom. There were a lot of different approaches to the way people talked about it, and everybody, the reason we kept inviting people back was that they got great responses, whatever their approach was.
I remember that the way it was structured is that the Philharmonic often did three or sometimes four performances of the same program. And I imagine you did this with your other educators, but with me, you had me come and do a talk before each.
Right.
And I had my notes, like one page of notes. I didn't read from a talk because I don't think it's interesting to be reading with your head down when you have an audience. Um, so my notes basically would say things like, uh, Carl Nielsen was born in Copenhagen and he spent time in Rome and whatever about Carl Nielsen because I was somehow with your Carl Nielsen educator. And
Lucky you. Yeah. We did a lot of Carl Nielsen because Alan Gilbert was
right,
recording all this at the time.
I know that. And I did all the Carl Nielsen lectures. I was very happy to do that because I was no expert at all in Carl Nielsen. So I had to go and really learn Carl Nielsen and call friends in Denmark and talk about Nielsen and learn every Danish thing that I could, and his operas and all of his music. And it was great. I was very happy to do that. But once I felt that I learned enough about Nielsen that I could teach him, studying the scores and so on, I then would just have one page in front of me, but mostly look at the audience and make eye contact. Now, if I basically want to deliver the same information for the same program, but the first group in front of me are, as happened once, a boy choir from Sydney, Australia, who were all their teenagers and so on. It was a very different experience than speaking to the people who took the subway in for the Friday morning matinee, who came in from the outer boroughs in New Jersey and Manhattan. Um, so that the facts were the same, but the audience was different. And in the case of Carl Nielsen, which I did a lot of, I always had to try to remember who these people are in front of me.
Hmm.
As I said, I recently spoke to Renee Fleming and I asked her how she plans a concert program. And she said, I think first of the audience, which is so obvious, but it makes a lot of sense. Because if it's a place like David Geffen Hall where she's sung often, she would do a different program than, let's say, if she's going to South Dakota, where she may not have appeared often and therefore would bring a different program to South Dakota than she would to Midtown Manhattan. Um, so when you did education, let's say you knew you had a group coming in of adults, let's say, just elderly people from Pennsylvania who were coming in on a bus, had never been to the New York Philharmonic. And I say elderly people from Pennsylvania because I had quite a few of those groups who were elderly people from Pennsylvania who came in on a Saturday and had their meal before, had me to talk to them, and then got the concert and then went back to Pennsylvania. Um, how did you adjust the education planning, or maybe you didn't?
No, I think that was your brilliance. But I will say that the elderly people from Pennsylvania, would also be interested just like in so how many people work here? It's like how long is it, just sort of information about the place. It's like what's the
The
budget?
budget,
How much
I
Yeah.
know. How
And
is that real
kids would
gold on
often
the
ask how
ceiling?
yeah. Yeah, teenagers had a tendency to ask how much do these musicians make? You know, the base salary of the New York Philharmonic player was public information, so we could share that. But
Right.
and some of them make considerably more, but that would blow people's minds. But I'd say like, yeah, you think the New York Yankees make good money? I mean, we're at the top of the field here, you know.
I remember one time I had a student group, there were student musicians from Virginia, but not a large city. They were from a small town, and the community got together to raise money to put the kids on a bus from Virginia to New York City, which probably was 8 or 10 hours. They left at dawn. They came for an afternoon concert, and then they went back to Virginia the same day. And I particularly love these groups in Virginia because America has great food everywhere, but there's a lot of very good cooking in Virginia. And these groups said to me, we don't know if there's any good food in New York City. So they brought their own. And they would arrive with hams and apple biscuits and fried chicken and potato salad and so on. And they always fed me because they would say to me, you don't get this stuff in New York. I mean, we do. We have fried chicken and ham and all that. But they wanted to share. And they would always say to me, well, you are so kind that you are teaching us about Beethoven. And we wanted to bring you something from Virginia. So have some ham. And I did. And it was so particular because these were the only people who brought their meals with them. And the Philharmonic understood that they were on a budget and accommodated them by providing a space where they could eat their meal before the concert. And I always thought that that was quite wonderful because um, these groups are so very different. I remember, as I said, the boy choir from Sydney, Australia, they all wore the same outfit and they all had incredibly good posture and they had no questions. And I love questions and, I'm happy to be contradicted or disagreed with or whatever. That's fine. Um, Not a word, but they all stood up at the end and formed a line and each shook my hand and moved on as they exited to go to the concert. And it was a choral concert. Um, so that I'm bringing this up, and this is not to criticize the Philharmonic, which I still love, but with changes in technology, with different approaches to education in the arts, with frankly budget cuts that have happened through the years, um, there are not these pre-concert programs anymore at the Philharmonic and at many orchestras, not just the New York Philharmonic. Things have changed significantly. I saw the first changes, and I don't recall if you were still there or had left, when I was asked one day to not do a class, but to make a video. And were you still there? It was about Joan of Arc. And the programming was
Oh,
about
yeah.
Joan of Arc.
Yes. Yes, I
And I
remember
did a video, which I guess people can find.
Honegger.
Yes, the Honegger, Joan of Arc at the stake, Jean d'Arc au Boucher. And
Marion Cotillard was there.
that's right,
Yeah.
Marion Cotillard, that's right. And so I did this video, and I love doing it because I'm friendly to video and media and all that stuff, and comfortable, obviously. Um, but um, but I remember thinking to myself that while I'm very happy to do this, and I was honored to be the one to be asked to do it, that I was wondering whether arts education was moving from the live and the intimate, which is what I experienced as a little boy with Leonard Bernstein, and that I've tried over a career to communicate with others. And you do this, and many people have done this, but maybe more in our age cohort than younger, and whether screens and streaming and distancing will change the way music education happens.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about it before, but that was a premonition of the pandemic, wasn't it?
Yes,
It's like already we were beginning to experiment with the screens, and then we were forced to be on the screens.
right.
I think we're all learning a lot about it, and just the way you conduct this conversation, shows how much we've learned about how to be effective in sharing information on a screen as opposed to in person. Um,
Well, as I said to you
but,
before we began,
different
I
things.
said, let's try to imagine that we have a room full of people listening to us because that's the way I approach these. I'm not creating a video. You and I are having a conversation, but instead of all being in a room in Manhattan, we have people in Lima, Peru, and Hong Kong, and Warsaw, and Cape Town, South Africa, and everywhere listening to us and drawing their own inspiration, I hope, and their knowledge from what we're talking about. But I'm not, quote,
Right.
making videos. Whereas the Joan of Arc one, you had a wonderful production team and they were very polished and the sound work was better than what I
Right.
do with Zoom and the all of the production values were terrific. But that serves a different purpose, I think, than a conversation that is held without the constraints of time and where you and I can talk about whatever comes up. And, I encourage you to, if I have not mentioned something you want to talk about, you go right ahead and talk about it because we would anyway. What have I left out?
Right. Well, a really important element of education at the Philharmonic at that time, and still, which you may not have been as aware of, was the work with young composers. And by young, I mean elementary school composers. Um, Associate principal bass of the orchestra at that time, John Deek, now retired from that position, but really developed this whole approach to kind of a blank slate method, he would call it, of just putting the tools in the hands of an 8-year-old to make music that could be played by members of the New York Philharmonic, so anything is possible. It's not just music for the other classmates to play on recorder with three different notes. It could be anything. And talk about connecting with how kids feel. It's kind of turning the model around now. It's starting with how they feel and turning that into music rather than coming the other direction. And that's just really blossomed all over the world. And that's what I spend summers doing in South Dakota. Ever since I left the Philharmonic, I've been working with teenagers on reservations in South Dakota who are composing music for the South Dakota Symphony
Hmm.
Orchestra. Um, so that was a really important contribution from the New York Philharmonic. It's not the only place where that work started, but that's the place that has been had the wherewithal to spread that gospel around the world so that it's well established in South Korea and in Finland and in Venezuela, countries that invest in music education, and being well established in a bunch of locations here. Um, yeah, so that's kind of the most radical to me expression of student-centered learning, where we're actually learning from the students. We're not teaching them to compose. We're enabling their ideas to take musical shape, and then they want to learn how to compose, right?
Hmm.
Is like it ignites the passion for learning.
And where do you send them to learn how to compose?
Yeah, that it's one thing when kids are turned on to composing here in New York City. There are so many places to go, all the community music schools, settlement schools. But in South Dakota on reservations, that's tough because they may have a music teacher in their reservation school, but they don't have the resources that we have here.
So, Ted,
So
I'm going to interrupt because you and I are Americans. When you say reservation, I know what you mean. But we have
yeah,
an international audience. Would you define what a reservation is in South Dakota?
yeah. So in the 19th century, there was a movement to move Native Americans onto what are called reservations, which are autonomous, self-governing zones. Those reservations sadly have been shrunk and shrunk and shrunk by land being taken back from them, despite treaties that go back centuries. But at any rate, the reservations of South Dakota are enormous. They take up a large amount of, probably they would add up in space in area to something like New England, because South Dakota is a large state and it's a large percentage of that state. Um, so yeah, the reservations are self-governing. They receive support from the federal government, but yeah, they tend to be in infertile areas. The
Mhm.
land that other people didn't want is where the Indians were sent to live.
Yeah. Um, I've never been to South Dakota. I've been to 41 states. There are nine I've not been to, and that's one of the nine. But I
Oh
gather
wow, we must
that
change
there's
that.
a I'd like to change that. I've not been to North Dakota either. As I said, I spent a lot of time in Minnesota and Wisconsin, and Iowa, but these are the surrounding states. But I never, and Nebraska, but I never got to the Dakotas, not yet. Um, I gather, and correct me if I'm wrong, that there's a very large musical instrument museum in South Dakota.
Yes, yes.
Have you been there?
No, but I'm going in January. I'm looking for
Mhm.
that. It's actually called the National Museum of Musical Instruments
Okay.
in Vermillion, South Dakota, on the campus of University of South Dakota. It's about an
Okay.
hour south of Sioux Falls, the major city.
Hmm. Well,
Yeah.
at some point, you and I are going to get together, and I'm going to ask you all about that museum because it's. I've been to other musical instrument museums in my life. I guess the big two that I really love, one was in Brussels, another in St. Petersburg, Russia, are wonderful
Wow.
museums. But I've heard that that one rivals these two in Brussels and St. Petersburg. So I would love to see
Yes.
it.
Yeah.
Um, do children, Native American children, also called Indians who live on these reservations, um, do they bear and continue their musical heritage as Native Americans, or
Yeah, it's a
are
great
they
question.
introduced to so-called classical music?
Yeah. Those who come to us for the composing program, which is like a summer camp situation, Very few of them are interested in tribal music, and very few of them have any contact with what we call classical music. So mostly it's a lot of them are really into heavy metal, music that's 30 and 40 years old. For some reason, that's still very current. Uh, the girls tend to be into Billie Eilish and sort of that area of popular music. So yeah, but interestingly, given the opportunity to imagine any kind of sound and to express whatever it is they want to express, very few of them use those styles to express it. They sort of start from a blank slate and just create some sounds on a keyboard or with an instrument, and we go from there. How you develop sounds into a larger structure, and but we often draw examples of that from pop music that they would know, right? At the
Mhm.
same time as introducing them to different kinds of sounds outside of that small gamut. Um, but it is always fun when there's one of them there's one who's been coming in recent years who's actually a member of a junior drum. So a drum there is a small ensemble of musicians who sing as well as drumming. They play on
Yeah.
one big drum, all of them playing together and singing with this particular very raw, loud vocalization that's just
Often very high
just
pitched.
thrilling.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Chest voice going way, way, way.
Yes. Right.
Um,
Something popped in my head that I mentioned a composer 15 minutes ago who I'm going to bring him back. Aaron Copland was a Brooklyn boy. He was a gay Jewish kid
yes,
from Brooklyn when people they were Jewish, but they were not openly gay. But he kind of was without telling everybody. But he was an openly gay person in the 1920s and 30s and 40s. And I mentioned him because although he came from that background, many people think that his music is the ultimate expression of what it means to be American. And his music depicted Appalachia and rodeos and Latin American music in the United States and the broad expanses of the plains and so on. Have you ever introduced music by Aaron Copland to the students in South Dakota? And do they respond to it differently? Do they sort of recognize
oh,
it as a depiction of their landscape?
that's interesting. No, no, I don't think I ever have. But now you've mentioned it, I'll do that this summer and see what kind of response
Yeah,
we.
because it's so much a part of our firmament here that when you put on a
Yeah,
television commercial for a fast food restaurant in Texas that's serving eggs and sausage, they will have Aaron Copland music because that sounds so American to them. Um,
right,
you know,
right.
rodeos and American landscapes and fanfare for the common man, which is held up
Billy
always
the
as,
Kid.
yeah, Billy the Kid, but it's especially fanfare for the common man, which we tend to hear.
Yeah,
You grew up in Washington at a lot of state ceremonies and so on. That funerals of presidents or important political leaders who left the world better than they found it. Um, Presidents such as Joseph Biden, who identifies with the worker, would tend to have fanfare for the common man as a musical
right,
motif that goes with them, even if when playing it, most people don't know that it's called fanfare for the common man.
right. It
I
just
would,
has that stirring kind
yeah,
of solemnity to it. Yeah,
that whatever America means. That Leonard Bernstein wrote many kinds of music, and he was a great. He admired Copland and looked at him like a father figure, a big brother figure, and played a lot of Copland with the Philharmonic. And Aaron Copland conducted his own music with the New York Philharmonic. But I think Leonard Bernstein's music is more edgy and urban, and
hmm,
I don't want to say sophisticated because I don't like that term, but attempting to convey whatever New York, street smart, clever, all of that. Whereas Aaron Copland, living in Brooklyn and then living in upstate New York, I believe, or Massachusetts, wrote music that you could plunk down in Oklahoma and it would sound like native music in a way that I can't think of another American composer who Charles Ives in his own way, but it was more about what Charles Ives cared about. But Aaron
Right.
Copland is
Roy Harris,
who's that?
Roy Harris also.
Yes, yes.
Uh, Roy Harris' Third
But
Symphony has that kind of sound. Yeah. But
there's
Aaron
something
Copland is the one whose specific works continue
right.
to convey that. Yeah.
Now I'm shifting from education to your being a composer. You
Mm.
have composed a lot of music through the years, and your musical life runs, I won't say on parallel tracks, but multiple tracks. And sometimes you might be doing more education, sometimes you might be doing more composition, working on a new piece. Um, how did you first find, I love this term, it's not my term, became alerted to the fact that you had the potential to be a composer? That's Ian McKellen's term. When he realized something, he always say, I became alerted to the fact.
Well, yeah, I mentioned earlier that when I went to college and started studying music theory, just understanding that there's a way that there are known ways to understand how music is put together and began doing that. And that merger of emotion with system, that creates art, uh, really, really worked for me. But it takes a long time to get beyond our idols. You know, like Bartok meant so much to me when I was a graduate student, and so I composed a lot of Bartok.
Hmm.
Which the world doesn't need secondhand Bartok. But and I composed a lot of Janacek, and you have to get through those things till you find what it is that you actually have to say. So it's a fascinating process, and you can only get through it in our world of classical music by getting people to play your music, even though it's still sort of en route to becoming what it's going to be. But I've had enough decades at it now that I think I finally found me.
Hmm. You studied with David Deltradich,
Yes.
who had one of the most
Yes.
distinctive names in all of the world, David of the 13. Did he ever tell you what that meant?
Well, he composed it right into his into Final Alice, into
Hmm.
that work where the orchestra all go count up in Italian until they get to the Tredici, and then all hell breaks loose. Uh, yes. So
It's such an unusual name. I met him, but I never really got to know him. And I wanted to ask him, why are you named David of the 13?
yeah, I never asked him that, but it was the family name, so
Right.
wherever they came from. Yeah. Yeah. So he was my principal teacher at Boston University, where I went for a master's in
Hmm.
composition. And then I studied with him privately for about 5 years after that. I still lived in the Boston area, but came down to see him in New York and would have like 3 hour lessons, which was as much about culture as it was about the music at hand. Um, he was a
That's what I want to ask.
really demanding.
How does one teacher transmit
Yeah.
this?
Yeah, that's a great question because I don't teach composition. I mean, what I do with young composers in South Dakota is one thing, but it's not what we think of as teaching composition to somebody who's already got the tools for composing and right. Um, and so I've had a number of teachers who work in different ways. In general, what happens is a student brings in a work in progress and plays through it for or with the teacher, and then gets commentary and questions and suggestions about that piece. And then the teacher may well suggest pieces to go listen to,
Mhm.
they would give you a frame of reference for where you might go with that piece, how Bruckner dealt with a particular situation, or Peter Maxwell
Repetitively.
Davis, or
I don't know if you remember that when one time you asked me to teach Bruckner, I said, "Can you get somebody else to do that?" I was open to
Yeah.
almost anything you asked for. I just felt that I didn't have the tools to teach Bruckner. I'm not against Bruckner, but had you asked me to teach Berlioz, I would have been the first person there right away.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
Bruckner was a mountain too craggy for me to climb and learn how to navigate.
It's
And
a very
I only
particular thing.
mention that because I can imagine if a teacher saw in a student something and handed the student Bruckner as opposed to Brahms, that the student may go off in very different directions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mentioned Bruckner because another of my teachers, Robin Holloway, when I was a student at Cambridge University in England, sent me to Bruckner 8 in particular because of the way I was constructing melodies,
Uh-huh.
and said, I can see what you're trying to do, but go hear how it's done correctly, you know. But David Del Tredici was demanding in that he was a virtuoso pianist. He had been a piano prodigy,
Hmm.
and he expected you to be able to actually play your orchestra score for him.
Wow.
And I grew up playing the piano. I'm a pretty good piano player. I'm not a pianist. I'm pretty good at playing the piano. And so I got by with him, and he would say, like, if you can't actually play it for me, you don't even know how it goes. Whereas some teachers just take your score and look at it and they hear it and then they make comments. He said, I don't believe in that. I can't hear your music by looking at it. I want to hear you play it. So he was very practical, and he would
Yeah.
be able to say, this is where it becomes boring, right here. you know, he was very practical about the impact that the music might make, not the style, not
Hmm.
how specifically you should go about writing music, but what the impact would be. And so a lot of people didn't like studying with him because it was just he said what he thought. It really wasn't coddling at all. So I took to that. And as I say, I managed to come study with him privately. He kept saying he doesn't take private students. He doesn't want any more students, I think. But I kept at him long enough that he took me. I think I was the first one who became a private student of his. And then I know others did.
Um, Listeners know that I often ask my guests to suggest a few composers, works, and so on. And these will be attached to the page for this particular conversation when listeners will go to it after the fact. You will find it attached. But one of the pieces you mentioned, which is a pretty good piece of music, is the St. Matthew Passion by J.S. Bach. And I mention this because um, there are many composers, music teachers, church people, uh, musicologists, mathematicians, scientists, and so on, who basically say that Bach is the foundational composer. And that if you learn that, not that you can do anything, but you can understand what you're supposed to be doing. How do you feel about this? Is the biggest, most banal, but it's a very good question. How do you feel about J.S. Bach?
Well, exactly as you just said. I mean, I play Bach every day at the keyboard from the Well-Tempered Clavier. Um, it's there's just it's indescribable, really, how emotion and technique are fused in Bach. It's just like it's the only way it could be. But with other composers, with Beethoven, Mozart, even you can sort of see how he got there. But with Bach, it's just a miracle every time. Um, so I mentioned the St. Matthew because the the every part of the St. Matthew's 3 hour work, right? But every part of it is so deeply felt. But I have to say, the opening chorus, every time I hear the first chord, I I just melt. I mean, the emotion of it is just so powerful. So yeah, I think for many of us composers in the Western classical world, it's like Bach is definitely the foundation, is the source. and certainly when you learn music theory, you're studying Bach chorales, you're studying Bach fugues. You know, Bach is like the foundation of how we learn to be composers.
Mhm. You and I have never had a conversation on religion. I know many people who are deeply religious who respond to something more in Bach. Um, by religious, I mean Christian religions. Although you don't have to be Christian to love Bach. There was an old brand of rye bread in New York called Levy's, and the advertising when I was a kid was, "You don't have to be Jewish to love Levy's bread." And it's the same thing. You don't have to be a Christian to love Bach. But I, in 2012, was an artist in residence at the Verbier Festival, and in Switzerland. And part of my job was to speak with artists, the way I'm speaking with you today. And one of the persons I spoke with was the wonderful bass baritone Thomas Klostoff, who
Mm-hmm.
has never minced words about the fact that he's not religious and he's sort of profoundly anti-organized religion. And yet he sings a great deal of Bach.
Yeah.
And I would ask him how he was able to square his very strong feelings about religion with this. And he said, number one, it's the music that is, I'm going to use my word, not his word, not necessarily cognizant of religion, but inspired by religion, but it's not promoting religion. So number two, if I'm singing the evangelist or whatever, I'm playing a character and I try to understand the character there, and then the music happens to be glorious. Um, Similarly, I have a very close friend, an Italian opera singer, very well known as soprano, and she's deeply religious. And when she sings certain works, such as Desdemona in Verdi's Otello, who is a Christian, or the Verdi Requiem, or Suor Angelica, she connects to the religious elements of the roles and the way Puccini and Verdi found inspiration in religion, even though Puccini was probably more religious than Verdi, um, found inspiration there in creation of the characters. So what I'm asking you is not so much are you religious or not, you can talk about that, but the way approaching music by Bach and other religious works, a mass in Czech that we may or may not know, Russian, gorgeous Russian choral traditions, French masses, American spirituals, all of that um, are informed by religious belief. And certainly St. Matthew Passion is one of those. When you approach a score such as St. Matthew Passion, is it the notes? Is it the words? Is it the message, for lack of a better term?
Yeah. Yeah. The miracle of it is that it's all of those things. Um, yeah, I am brought up in the Christian church and am active in the Episcopal Church, and that that the whole complex of stories in the Judeo-Christian tradition have spawned so much art. You know, just think of all the different you just mentioned, you know, from African American spirituals to J.S. Bach to, you know, so many, and you know,
Janacek,
Michelangelo.
Mussorgsky, yeah.
Yeah, Janacek. Yeah, plus the visual art, plus, you know, is like such a wellspring at the root of our civilization. And it's just always, I guess, you know, in a way that that complex of stories and characters that we call the Judeo-Christian tradition provide sort of a common ground for creativity in many directions and for understanding other people's work, you know, in different styles. We all have that basis if there are religiously inspired works to understand that style of music because they're expressing something we're familiar with. It's kind of our lingua franca.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned something in passing that I provokes a question for me, and I thank you for this. Um, you know that I lived and worked and continue to feel very attached to Italy. And on my first visit when I was 17, among the places I went to was Assisi before they had an earthquake. And these great paintings by Giotto were there that were telling the story of stories from the Bible, primarily to people who couldn't read. And a lot of times we go into churches in Italy, not only in a lot of countries, and there's glorious art. And sometimes they will put on music, often by Bach or Palestrina or certain people, Vivaldi, that I don't want to say make us feel different about the paintings, but are musical narratives of the same thing that's being narrated in the painting. You go to these great Italian cathedrals in Siena, in Assisi, mostly central Italy, but also the Scrovegni Chapel in Padova is one of the greatest. The Arena Chapel, it's often called, where basically you have scenes from the Bible, the Christian Bible, the Old Testament, the New Testament, that are meant to educate people on stories that they were unable to read because at that time, 800 years ago, 700 years ago, most people could not read. So therefore, the lessons happened in the visual and in different ways, the acoustical with the music. How do you feel about the pairing of visual art with music when it's on the same topic?
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. This is something I'm thinking about a lot right now. My second violin concerto premieres in South Dakota in January and is going to be a multimedia presentation. Um, and the woman who is designing the projections is fortunately a musician and very sensitive to the relationship between what we see and what we hear, because it's so easy for music to become a soundtrack uh,
Mm-hmm.
when there's anything visual. And of course, there's more and more experimentation by orchestras and soloists, opera companies with projection. Of course, with opera, you have a story going anyway, but with abstract music, figuring out the relationship between the visual and the or auditory is tricky.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there's just a different pacing of what you expect to take in with your eyes and what you hear. So yeah, it's something I'm thinking about a lot these days.
Mm-hmm. Often when I teach music, um, I encounter young people, older people who may not have a strong feeling for the bone structure of music, but feel more open to commenting on visual art. And
Sure.
I try to bring to them the relationship, not because, for example, Bach wrote about Leonardo da Vinci, he didn't. But my feeling is that if you are drawn to Bach and his world and his brain, you might be drawn to Leonardo da Vinci.
Mm-hmm.
I use the big three. I use the big three of the Renaissance. I use Leonardo with Bach, Michelangelo with Beethoven, and Raphael with Mozart. And I'm not saying that
Nice.
one immediately corresponds to the other, but if you kind of like the beautiful Raphael Madonnas or the utopian wrestling with eternity that Michelangelo does on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, you're more likely to be drawn maybe to the similar wrestling that Beethoven did throughout his musical life.
Yeah,
And,
what an interesting idea. Yeah.
and I use, for example, Delacroix with Berlioz. As you know, Berlioz is a big favorite of mine. And it's not that there's an immediate alignment. And if, for example, you don't like Delacroix, it doesn't mean you won't like Berlioz. But sometimes something like The Wrath of the Medusa is the way in to discover Les Troyens with Berlioz.
Mm-hmm.
And for people who love big opera productions, Zeffirelli type productions, I often use Paolo Veronese, who had these big architectural paintings with lots of small dramas going on in that. And one of those paintings could also be Zeffirelli's La Boheme at the Met. Not because
Mm-hmm.
Puccini relates to Paolo Veronese, but there's just something about the way we see that painting that may lead
Mm-hmm.
us into Boheme or Otello, I think, in more my taste. because of the Venetian aspects of
Hmm.
Otello, the Venetian aspects of Paolo Veronese, who his name means he was from Verona, but he was part of the Venetian Empire. Um, and similarly, Romare Bearden, Duke Ellington, there are many contemporary examples of that. And sometimes, we take a contemporary artist, and I'm not saying that the contemporary artist has to reflect a quote classical composer, but I've never asked a composer this before, so you're the first, pal. Name the visual artist that corresponds to the music of Theodore Wiprud. If there
Oh
is
my
one.
goodness. Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'll have to get back to you on that one.
Okay. It's not Edvard Munch, I can tell you that.
Glad to hear that.
Yes, even though he was Norwegian, it's not. It's just not.
Right, nor would he correspond with Grieg.
Not at all. Or Ibsen.
No.
These great Norwegian.
Or
A couple of years ago in this program, had one of my favorite pianists, Leif Ove Ansnes, a Norwegian pianist. And we spoke a fair amount about Norway. And I told him about the Norwegian Seamen's Church in Brooklyn and how I learned Norwegian culture there. But think about it. I'd love to know from you sometime, because I'm not a composer, but I know what visual artists really inspire me.
yeah.
And how, I mean, for example, I think a case can be made for Richard Strauss and Gustav Klimt.
Oh, of course. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And I never
Yeah,
thought of that
actually,
before.
I'm thinking of a way into answering your question, which is that there are several artists whose work has inspired my music.
Go ahead.
And so it might be that there's a correspondence there. One is John Singer Sargent.
Mm.
I've done a suite for solo piano about Sargent's women paintings, not the portraits, society portraits, but the archetypes like El Jaleo, the flamenco dancer,
Hmm.
Miss Ellen Terry as Lady Macbeth, paintings like that.
So I'm going to
So
have you pause
Singer,
because I know exactly who Sargent was, but tell our audience a bit who John Singer Sargent was and his straddling of Boston and Paris, and because he was a major painter, but he's best known, I think, in Boston and Paris and New York to some degree.
I think that's true. American painter, gosh, I can't say with confidence what decades, but probably the 1880s, 90s, 1900s, 1910s, something like that.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, Boston, Paris, as you said. He made a lot of money as a portraitist for wealthy people, but he was also a highly experimental painter in oils and also in watercolors, and an amazing draftsman with charcoal. Yeah, you especially find his works in Boston. It's true. Um, so there's something about his marrying of technique with sort of flights of fancy, making you see things in new ways that really turns me on as a composer. And then in a very different vein, a living painter named Pat Lipsky, who paints, is an abstract painter, mostly in geometric forms. So absolutely non-figurative and non-representational. But she kind of opened the door for me to understand how abstract art, as the saying goes, it doesn't depict the emotion, it is the emotion, right?
Huh.
And that's what music is as well, right? Music is the emotion. It doesn't depict it. When you hear it, if you understand it, you're feeling that emotion. And so her paintings have also kind of inspired me. So I don't know if anybody like you in creating a talk about the music of Wiprud would gravitate to either of those painters, but they're painters that I've gravitated to creatively.
So I'm writing down what you just said because it's pretty wonderful. Okay,
Pat
now that gives me
Lips.
something to think about for 2025. Music doesn't depict the emotion, it is emotion. Thank you, Ted. This will nourish me for an entire year, pal. I just thought of another one that
You're
I never
welcome.
thought of before. Um, Edward Hopper and Leonard Bernstein.
Hmm. Yeah, especially of the Leonard Bernstein of What's the three pieces from the Lonely Town
That's
is
what I
one
was thinking of.
of the three pieces.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, when Lenny died, there was a memorial, um, several memorials here in New York. And at the same time, Jesse Norman was doing a recital at Carnegie Hall. And I knew her. I worked with her a lot. She was formidable and intelligent and very strong-minded about what she thought was right, but open to other ideas. And in my view, and this is said with great respect, she was rehearsed within an inch of her life on everything that she did. And that meant that she had a mastery of the music and all the ideas, but sometimes there was not enough breathing room to go in the moment to whatever
Mm.
she as an artist might have been moved to go to. But when Lenny died, she was singing at Carnegie Hall and she added an encore, and the encore she added, she clearly had not rehearsed, and that was Lonely Town. In other words, how New York without Leonard Bernstein will be a lonely town. And I'm getting goosebumps as I say this. It was so gorgeous because she had probably just looked at the music and the words and had
Ah,
not
right.
calcified her interpretation. Forgive me, Jesse, for saying calcified your interpretation, but but I think we know what I mean. This is not a criticism of her. It was her stylistic preference that she understood everything about the music and the words and the languages and the subtleties and the where the accents go. She understood everything, but and she would bring that across. But in this particular case, because she couldn't, because he had died a day or two before, she could not do that same deep interpretation. What she sang was so spontaneous and so gorgeous, and it was Lonely Town, which I know we have on Adagio, and therefore I want listeners to listen to Lonely Town, which was done both as a ballet, I believe it on the town, or not on the town,
On the Town. Yes, that's it.
on the
Yes.
town, but also in the film with Gene Kelly and Frank Sinatra. It became a sort of
Oh,
ballet
really?
in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. That's exactly where it was set, in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And and what they did in that wonderful film was that I don't recall who the director was, but he pulled back the camera very slowly. It began with an isolated figure and then pulled back the camera so slowly that you just saw this one figure surrounded by New York, but with no other people around. And they played Leonard Bernstein's Lonely Town. And that could have been an Edward Hopper painting. Now that I think about it, I'd never thought about it before. And
Mm.
listeners, this is what people like Ted and I and people of our ilk do. We find pleasure and fascination and inspiration even in tough times, in lonely times, because music is this wonderful, it's the sea. It has a lot of salt in it. So it keeps us bobbing along on the top and rocking us and challenging us and so on. But we never sink because it keeps us aloft. And
We're buoyed up.
it
Yeah.
really does. And my friend, you and I have been conversing for two wonderful hours.
Time
And
flies.
it zipped by. And I hope that audiences for I Dodge around the world have discovered someone that I've admired for a very long time, but who's given me many opportunities to speak and teach and so on. But I never had the opportunity to sit down with you, which is something I've always wanted to do. And so, Ted Wiprud, I thank you so very much.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. It's been a really fun couple of hours. Thanks, Fred.